Let me introduce our speaker now. Dr. Jörg Haustein is lecturer in world Christianities at the University of Cambridge and director of studies at Selwyn College, Cambridge. His research specializations are in Christianity and Islam in Africa, with a special interest in Pentecostalism, colonialism and Islam, and the interrelation between religion and international development. From 2016 to 2019, he was co-convener of the AHRC-funded research network, Keeping Faith in 2030, Religions and the Sustainable Development Goal, which investigated the integration of religious actors in the setting and implementation of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Dr. Haustein has just finished a large manuscript. Dr. Haustein has finished a large manuscript on Islam and Islam in German East Africa. He's currently engaged in various publications on Pentecostalism and is associate editor of the forthcoming Brill Encyclopedia on Global Pentecostalism. Today for our webinar, he will speak to us on the topic World Christianity and International Development, Contours of a Long History. So thank you very much, Jörg, and let us all welcome him. And now over to you.
Right. Thank you, Mutaraj, for this lovely introduction. Let me just switch over to sharing my screen so you can see the words a bit better. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Here we are. All right. Yeah, thanks so much for your introduction, Mutaraj, and for the chance to present here. I was actually organizing the papers for this term, and I would not have thought to put myself forward, but we had one cancel on us. And since both of the other papers are on religion development, we talked about last week about orthodoxy and domestic violence, not last week, last seminar, and we will have another one later on about Pentecostals and development in Nigeria. So I thought that I have a paper that kind of fits that trajectory that I might sort of interject in the middle. And this is a sort of a draft of a longer history of religion and development that came out of really a bit of an irritation. And that irritation was that a number of development studies books have appeared in recent years about the rediscovery of religion and development. And then, of course, as somebody who studies Christian missions and religion in Africa, you kind of wonder, when was it ever gone? So this is what this paper is based on. And this is an article that appeared in Religion. It's a bit broad brush, at least for me. I tend to be a rather detail-oriented historian. So, but what this does, I think, is it helps us see how the history of development is entwined with European debates about the role of church and state, about the role of Christianity in society, and that inferring from that the role of religion elsewhere in the world. And this is really what I want to show in this contours of a longer history. So to come to the paper, I just want to start off with this quote. The point is, when we realize that development is some kind of substitute for the progressive, linear, and liberal concept of history, we simply must become suspicious. In particular, when we reckon with the well-known interpretation that this concept is ultimately a secularist version of a Judeo-Christian idea, and that is that the course of history is continuously moving forward to salvation. This insightful quote by Harskamp and others from 2004, I think, points us to the fact that religion and development have more of a common history than is often recognized in the recent turn to religion in development practice and development studies. Here, the importance of religious actors for development is sometimes presented as something of a new discovery. Development in this literature is portrayed as an originally secular concern, which only recently has begun to open up to the potency and sensibilities of religion. This narrative is certainly useful to highlight, if not, as I want to argue, to prepare, the recently rising development studies interest in religion. But it comes with a twofold forgetfulness of history. Firstly, there's a tendency to begin international development with Truman's second inaugural address from 1949, which eclipsed the much longer history of colonial regimes, with this kind of history, which eclipsed the much longer story of colonial regimes of development in their relation to Christian missions and notions of religious progress. While the post-World War II development project departs from these earlier colonial notions in some ways, it also inherits its humanitarian and ultimately Christian rhetoric of global progress, alongside the structural resources of the established Christian missions. Secondly, the emphasis on the ostensible secularity of the post-Second World War development occludes the making of the secular as a particular configuration of the Western discourse about the future of Christianity and religion more widely from the 1960s onward. With few exceptions, these neoclassical sociological theories fail to provide an adequate contemporary account of global religion, but rather continued older debates about the relevance of Christianity to the functioning of societies and political regimes. Development studies, as will be shown below, borrowed from this debate about secularism and inherited some of the same problems, most importantly, the mismatch between sociological rhetoric of the rising irrelevance of religion in the modern world and lived reality outside of Europe. From this vantage point, the recent rediscovery of religion as a significant social force is more of a reckoning with the limits of the secularization paradigm in much of the world and in contemporary politics. The point of these observations, of course, is not to argue that development is essentially a religious or Christian exercise, or that religion has some sort of natural importance for the practice and study of development. Rather, I aim to show that historically, the discourses of religion and development have been interwoven with the history of Christianity in the West, from the colonial civilizing mission and the post-Second World War American development ideal, to the emergence of secular progress ideologies in the 1960s, and finally to the recent refocusing of development on faith-based actors. The latest turn toward the interrelation of religion and development, therefore, is not a rediscovery, but the continuation of a much longer story of European and North American institutions casting their particular visions of progress on the world. Now, one could begin such a history anywhere, but a useful entry point for examining the interrelated history of debates about religion and development is the anti-slavery movement, and it's important for the European push toward the African interior. And again, this is a really rough contour history. You'll forgive me for going over some details that are actually quite important. The British anti-slavery movement had celebrated its first success in the abolition of the Slave Trade Act of 1807. And while this was a remarkable achievement of, as Richard Reed called it, a curious alliance of Enlightenment, humanism, and evangelical outrage, it had been made possible, if not politically advantageous for Britain, by the geopolitical context of the time, most importantly, the loss of the American colonies and the Napoleonic Wars. Following the Slave Trade Act, Britain succeeded in forcing other countries to adopt similar policies, most notably in the United States, which ended the import of slaves from January 1808. Yet, as is well known, these measures had only a very limited impact on the transatlantic slave trade, which now continued via Cuba under French, Spanish, and Portuguese flags, while the US mainly relied on its internal slave market and the birth of slave children. In this environment, the Royal Navy's efforts to suppress directly the shipment of slaves across the Atlantic had little effect on the overall numbers, but it did, of course, underscore and reinforce the British Empire's growing power over the West African coast, while asserting its moral authority over the anti-slavery cause. It was in this context that the anti-slavery movement joined forces with colonization advocates in various quarters, forming unusual alliances and beginning to drum for an entirely different project, the civilizing and development of Africa. An important manifesto for this project was Thomas Fowle Buxton's The African Slave Trade and its Remedy from 1840. Buxton was a Quaker, member of Parliament, co-founder of the Anti-Slavery Society, and a leading voice of the second generation of anti-slavery activists. Most importantly, he combined Christian and humanitarian rhetoric with global and local economic analysis, providing a blueprint for many subsequent calls to develop Africa. Buxton argued that even in the unlikely event that all nations would join forces to suppress the slave trade, this would still not suffice to end the practice due to the enormous profit margins the trade provided. Instead, an alternative economy needed to be established in Africa for, as Buxton called it, improving her own state, while, and I quote again, adding to the enjoyments and stimulation of commerce in the civilized world, end of quote. With the proper stimulus, this was entirely achievable, according to Buxton, because Africa possessed, as he said, vast, though as yet undeveloped resources, which could be exploited instead of the slave trade if her population was sufficiently enlightened, end of quote. At the same time, new markets could be opened up for European goods through African consumption, which in turn would be achieved by a threefold program in Africa, and I quote again, to encourage her commerce, to improve the cultivation of her soil, and to raise the morals and the minds of her inhabitants, end of quote. The parallels of Buxton's thoughts with 20th century development philosophy are obvious. In the absence of a political will to eradicate a global system of exploitation, the energies instead focused on the hope that the system can be bypassed and perhaps defeated by installing a different economy among those most affected by its destructive consequences. For implementing this alternative economy, Buxton foresaw the necessity of a wide alliance of, I quote, the merchant, the philanthropist, the patriot, and the Christian, end of quote. And indeed, Buxton's own reliance on the slavery advocate James McQueen for advocating the Niger expedition pays testimony to this broad colonial platform. Christianity was instrumental in this development alliance. And Buxton says, and I have the quote here on my slide, "Let missionaries and schoolmasters, the plow and the spade go together and agriculture will flourish. The avenues to legitimate commerce will be opened, confidence between man and man will be inspired, while civilization will advance as the natural effect and Christianity operate as the proximate cause of this happy change." The aims of Buxton's Society for the Extinction of the Slave Trade and for the Civilization of Africa read like a modern development program. Enable literacy by producing scripts for local languages, provide medical education to prevent diseases, improve agricultural methods, and end human trafficking. While the Niger expedition of 1841 was a spectacular fail, it was a culmination point in the longer history of the slogan of commerce and Christianity, which would then go on to become the guiding phrase for the interplay of missionary and colonial ventures throughout the 19th century, wrapped in providentialist theology about the God-given mission to the world. Arguably, the most important figure for popularizing the concept of commerce and Christianity was, of course, David Livingstone, who echoed Buxton's call in the 1850s and 60s. And by now, attention had begun to shift from West to Central and East Africa, where the Arab slave trade provided the backdrop against which new missionary initiatives were established. Alongside Livingstone's career from a dissenter evangelical missionary of the LMS to the famous explorer, the evangelical anti-slavery and evangelical anti-slavery development activism morphed into a mainstream cause. Livingstone's speech in Cambridge in 1857 turned into the foundational myth of the university's mission to Central Africa, which now adopted his Pathfinder mission of commerce and Christianity as legacy bequeathed to the Anglican establishment. While these grand development schemes of abolishing the slave trade by establishing new economic ties to the interior could not be realized in the mid-19th century mode of African exploration, abolitionism activism remained entwined with development rhetoric, now increasingly cast as the Christian civilizing mission. The work of the Spiritan Fathers in East Africa is a perfect example for this dynamic. When their work began in Zanzibar from 1863 onward, they quickly established a population of dependents by ransoming children on the local slave market. The strategic consideration behind this was that children might be formed into Christians far easier than adults, and that thus a nucleus of an African Christian church could be established for the future of the evangelization of the interior. And of course, the sort of Christian model village begins here as well. By 1868, the Spiritans established an agricultural colony just outside Bagamoyo, an important caravan terminus on the East African coast, because they believed that the rhythm of agricultural work and spiritual exercises would benefit their protégés and carry them naturally to Christian civilization, as Pater Horner put it. Bagamoyo became a sizable plantation and a Christian model village, and its focus on labor and labor education received high praise by well-known colonial explorers and activists such as Stanley and Herman van Wissmann. For both colonial advocates, these labor regimes fit with their racist perceptions of African laziness and their colonial schemes of turning subsistence economies into profitable labor markets. The Christian civilizing mission thus became the development scheme of the colonial push for the interior of Africa. By the end of the 19th century, anti-slavery trade activism was politically employed against the Omani Swahili caravan trade in the interest of the colonial conquest of East Africa. Initially, England and Germany, the two main European powers in the East, aside from Portugal, of course, further south, were not interested in the continental slave economy, but anti-slavery causes soon proved useful for mobilizing for conquest, especially on the side. That was the only way they could bring Protestants and Catholics and industrialists all together under the anti-slavery cause. In fact, the short-lived German anti-slavery movement was constructed precisely for this purpose and helped to overcome parliamentary opposition to colonial conquest in 1888. Now, with the post-scramble establishment of colonial governance in the 1890s, the platform of commerce and Christianity was quickly replaced by a complex field of diverging interests between colonial governments, missionaries, settlers, and other economic interest groups. Depending on local circumstances, this led to cooperation, competition, or conflict, and the developmental aims of the civilizing mission became more fluid. It is impossible to give a useful account of these colonial dynamics in such a short paper, and I want to therefore draw on my own sort of backyard, as it were, in research, and bring in examples from Germany, East Africa. While German colonial debates certainly did not have the same paradigmatic impact as the French idea of mise en valeur or the British concept of the dual mandate, the existence of similar debates in this fairly minor colonial power shows that the making of modern development ideas was rooted in the wider ideological concepts of Europe's mission to the world. The first feature that emerges when studying the German civilizing discourse in East Africa was that whatever notions of the Christian civilizing missions the conquest platform had purported to embody, they quickly gave way to more straightforward modes of colonizing for profit. Almost immediately, with the mobilization for conquest, the aforementioned Friedrich Fabry, who was the father of this anti-slavery platform, began to dismantle his anti-slavery platform and called for bold infrastructure investments instead. He now said it's going to take a long time until we can get rid of slavery, and we need to really invest in infrastructure instead and build a different economy. The colonial press followed suit and pivoted from its earlier calls to oust Arabs to questions of integrating Islam and harnessing its potential for instilling discipline and labor ethics among Africans, again characterized as indolent and lazy. While slave hunting and large-scale slave trade were suppressed, slavery itself was never abolished during German rule. In the political debate, slavery was reframed as an African version of serfdom, so as an institution providing social benefits which could only be abolished in a long-term process of economic restructuring. And this restructuring problem was what the Germans called the labor issue, the persistent shortage of wage labor, of a wage labor force for the production of cash crops and thereby colonial surpluses. So how do you transition a subsistence farmer to the plantation? How do you entice a person to work for money? Various taxation regimes were tried, contract regulations, deceptive recruitment practices, and German plantation owners and their allies often resorted to coercive means for what they called labor education. And this encompassed the brutal treatment of so-called lazy workers, community labor regimes, or the criminal punishment for the breaking of contract. If you broke contract in East Africa, you quickly found yourself in chains. So the echoes of early slavery are very clear. This development for exploitation, as Yui Koponen called it in 1994, became the guiding framework of colonial rule in East Africa and beyond. It superseded humanitarian and religious causes while being itself framed in the language of economic progress and the ultimate emancipation of the population subjected to this process. Consequently, and this is the second feature of colonial religion and development in Germany, East Africa, Christian missions now had to measure up against this economic development and their contribution. So, for example, just after the Conquest War, Hermann von Wissmann, a Prussian Protestant and who led the conquest and then also was sort of the first interim governor of the colony, praised the Catholic missionary labora et ora culture, as he called it, so work first and then pray, over the allegedly intellectualist conversion attempts made by Protestants. In what became an unusually public feud between a German official and Protestant missionaries, Wissmann contended that Africans were incapable of understanding the religion of love and that the outwardness of the Catholic cult, as he called it, was the only way, I quote, to raise the savage to a higher form of being, end of quote. Other colonial activists contended that the pragmatism and fatalism of Islam, as they saw it, would be far more suitable to colonial development. Missionaries reacted by arguing that sustainable civilizing was only achieved on the basis of Christianity, however, and its ethics. And this argument became a recurring source of debate, especially when missionaries perceived the allegedly Islam-friendly German colonial policies as a threat. As late as 1915, missionary opponents argued that I quote, a compromise between the Islamitic and Christian worldview would be necessary to provide the right measure of compulsion in what they called the labor issue. These tensions between the missionary and the settler projects of colonial development were also a part of British rule in East Africa and other colonial contexts beyond, but I'm just highlighting the German example here. Thirdly, despite these differences about the aims and process of civilizing, the practical contributions made by missionaries were crucial to the colonial development project nonetheless. Missions continued to mobilize the German public behind the civilizing cause through their adult magazines, through their juvenile magazines, through their grassroots activism. Even more important were the services of missions on the ground, despite their occasional disagreement with the government. Missionaries provided valuable trade, information links to rural contacts. They deputized for colonial governments in legal disputes and administration. They accrued knowledge about languages and cultures. And more importantly, they offered crucial medical and educational services. Even though in Germany, East Africa, the government had installed a much contested secular school system for training children of Muslim notables, missionary pupils outnumbered those of government schools by 20 to 1. And the numbers are similar when you then look to British tropical East Africa. In the 1940s, you have 96% of pupils being educated by mission schools. So in their manifold provisions, missions compensated for the failures of the colonial economy in rapidly transitioning contexts. And as Manji and O'Coyle argue in a slightly juvenilely titled article, The Missionary Position, they essentially took the same structural position that NGOs occupy in the development economy today. So civilizing Africa, therefore, was one of the central arenas in which European societies debated the relevance and the place of Christianity in the colonial efforts of developing a modern world. Unlike the earlier humanitarian rhetoric of the anti-slavery movement, colonial development was articulated primarily in economic, political, and anthropological universals but precisely this opened up the discourse for an intensive and at times critical discussion of the role of Christianity therein. As they played an important, if subsidiary, role in stabilizing colonial economies and polities, missionaries joined in the discussion of ethical and ideological principles of colonialism while being judged themselves with regard to their contribution to colonial development. Now, moving on to the time after the Second World War, and here it quickly became apparent that the old colonial model was going to be replaced by a new configuration of the global economy and its international relations. The north-south contrast between colonizers and colonized began to pale against the east-west divide of competing political systems, and the resulting geopolitics necessitated different patron-client relations with the former colonies. The erstwhile civilization deficits of colonies were now recast as underdevelopment, as gross domestic product became the main measure of inequality among de jure equal states. For the West, Truman's Marshall Plan of 1948 and his Global Development Program, announced in his second inaugural of 1949, the so-called Point Four speech, became the hallmark of a new economic and military interventionism in the name of human progress, framed in a modernist language of prosperity and based on the scientific and economic rationality. However, this does not mean that this was an entirely new program of humanitarianism, nor that religion and development were now emphatically separate concerns, as was later claimed by Jeffrey Haynes and others. Alongside this ideological and structural heritage of colonial civilizing, this new development project inherited the important role of religion, which was only gradually transformed in the next decades alongside emerging secularization theories. So this new development program wasn't secular in its impetus. Truman's aforementioned inaugural address is itself a case in point. After spelling out in very modernist language of scientific progress his bold new program for the improvement and growth of underdeveloped areas, Truman turned to Christian rhetoric in order to drive his point home. His closing words reflected the Sermon on the Mount, one of the two Bible texts he had rested his hand on when taking his oath of office just moments before. And this is how he ends his speech. Steadfast in our faith in the Almighty, we will advance toward a world where man's freedom is secure. To that end, we will devote our strength, our resources, and our firmness of resolve. With God's help, the future of mankind will be assured in a world of justice, harmony, and peace. These professions, for the sake of humanity, for the sake of humanitarian interventions, portray a certain continuity of the post-Second World War development project with its 19th century forebears. This is not to argue for simple ideological parallels between Truman and Victorian humanitarianism. Instead, Truman's inaugural remarks arguably adhered primarily to the tropes of US presidential speeches that Robert Bellah had called civil religion. Yet Truman's speech shows nonetheless that the mobilizing rhetoric for his bold new program, as he called it, did not rest in a vision of scientific progress alone, but was framed and fortified by Christian ideals of social justice, providentialism, and post-millennial eschatology. I kind of left out the boldest area in the quote, which is right here. Our allies are the millions who hunger and thirst after righteousness. So you can really see the bringing in of biblical imagery here. So this civil religion of this new development did not do away with God, but placed him inside a universalizing ethic, and in ethics and the aspirational rhetorics of American exceptionalism. Despite a now burgeoning sector of secular development agents, the earlier import of missions did not simply cease. An important colonial continuity for the Global Development Project lay in the charitable monopoly that Christian missions still possessed in social care, education, and poverty alleviation. The foreseeable future of post-colonial independence led to various tactical responses in what Okbukalu in 2003 called a passive revolution. One strategy for retaining influence in post-colonial states was the employment of indigenous personnel in various missionary institutions, still funded and led from abroad. A new language of partnership and participation enabled the continued channeling of development interventions through Christian missions, while cementing the continued flow of resources and programs from the first to the third world. The so-called moratorium debate of the early 1970s aptly highlights the problem of African dependency on missionary church and development funds, yet in the end failed to dislodge the fundamental funding structures. Even in countries like Ethiopia, where a Marxist state appropriated the church's development assets, missionary impact proved remarkably resilient in the long run. Despite significant disruptions, churches and other Christian development organizations remained an important channel for development aid, to the point of these efforts providing a political foothold and re-entry under an openly anti-religious regime. The interrelation of Christianity and development found another major outlet in Latin American liberation theology, which became a major amplifier of the anti-modernist dependency theory of development and a pioneer in communal activism. The liberationist political theological program of holistic development was also adapted in different contexts, such as Minjung theology in Korea, Indian, Dalit theology, Black theology, and South African anti-apartheid theology, though the latter with a notably more political turn. It is worth mentioning here as well that religions other than Christianity were equally unaffected by the alleged secularism of the post-war development project, drawing on and debating their own theological institutional heritage in social engagement. In the case of Africa, Islamic reform movements provided a useful example for the continued political and social proximity of religion development. You can look at Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, for example, or Saudi Arabia's role in bringing African students to Saudi Arabian universities, which strengthens Wahhabism, and even socialist autocrats of African Muslim countries like Gaddafi in Libya or Numairi in Sudan or Barre in Somalia regularly invoked Islamic principles for justifying not just political but also developmental aims, such as greater gender equality or economic progress. So against this context of a continued, if not rising, relevance of religion for development ideology and practice throughout the 20th century, the progressing marginalization of religion in Western development thought and practice appears in stark contrast. I would argue, therefore, that the emerging secularism of development discourse hardly emerged from the engagement with recipient countries, but should be read as a consequence of sociological secularization theories driving modernization ideas in the West. A useful and frequently cited example of this high modernism of development theory was Rostov's influential The Stages of Economic Growth, a non-communist manifesto. This universal theory of economic development took relatively little note of religion and downplayed Weber's idea of religion influencing the transformation of economic systems. However, in two respects, religion continued to frame even Rostov's argument. Firstly, when explaining why his model of liberal development would be preferable to the historical determinism and ruthless utilitarianism of Marxism, he suddenly fell back on Christianity as a fundamental expression of democratic values and a sustainable value system. Quoting his MIT colleague, a military historian by the name of Elting Morrison, Rostov contrasted the allegedly socialist evil of putting a defined utopian ends above the means with the allegedly foundational Christian ethic of democracy. So this is a book where you read nothing about religion at all. It kind of argues that humanity will develop forward and we can lift underdeveloped countries. He has this analogy of an airplane taken off to the cruising altitude of such a self-perpetuating economy. And then suddenly you read something like this. For our civilization, we have agreed that it was most memorably stated in the New Testament with its intense concern for the relationship of man to himself and the next man to him, with its distrust of logical systems and uniform solutions, its parables radiating off their ambiguous meanings, its biting conflicting admonitions, and its insistence that wisdom is only wise if, as the situation change, what is wise also changes. Such a view of things, such a New Testament view of things, appears to have been in the minds of those who invented democracy. Secondly, Religion was also featured on Rostov's speculative outlook beyond the fifth and final stage of development of that airplane taking off, what he calls the age of mass consumption. Here, or mass consumerism. Here, Rostov mused whether humanity could be able to overcome the ensuing spiritual stagnation or spiritual boredom, which was a fairly striking admission of the limits of economizing development. Therefore, even for Rostov, a main scholarly reference for Cold War development theory, religion is not entirely absent, but it appears as bookends in the history of societal development. It founds democracy and it will guide the end of things. Now, the point of these observations is not to argue that religion had an invariable presence in 20th century development thought, or that the latter was not really secular. Instead, the argument is that Rostov's remarks help elucidate the place and continued role of religion in secularization theories. Rostov's evolutionary system of stages fundamentally rested on Talcott Parsons' modernization theories. Parsons, in turn, was the foremost translator and interpreter of Max Weber's work in American sociologies, and arguably he's the one who sort of led the Weber Renaissance. But he deviated from Weber in two respects, which is important for Rostov's understanding of development and religion. Firstly, Parsons took an optimistic view of modern capitalism, a more optimistic view of modern capitalism than Weber. So Weber famously calls it the iron cage, right? And thus, in the words of Niels Gilman, Parsons was perfectly suited for development crusaders trying to sell the American vision of modernity to post-colonial regions. End of quote. Secondly, Parsons' interpretation overemphasized the role of normative dimensions in Weber's sociology, including religion. This was due to Parsons' own sociology, which ascribed central integrating and legitimating functions to religion. And these functions, according to Parsons, were impeded in modernity through processes of differentiation and pluralization. So as a result, Parsons saw religions retreating from the public sphere through privatization, leaving behind a moral community built around value generalizations. And this process of privatization and value generalization helps explain why Rostov returns to religion only in the ethical framing of his theory of development. So religion is only useful for general ethical frames of reference, but otherwise it's private. Belief is private. So the secular character of the post-1960 development theory therefore does not point to a simple absence of religion or an a-religious character of development, but to a specific place assigned to religions and academic thought in consequence to the perceived decline of Christianity in the developed world. Parsons' idea, of course, formed the core of the neoclassical theories of secularization developed by the likes of Peter Berger, Thomas Luckmann, and Niklas Luhmann. And these theories were mirrored in Christian theologies as well, most famously perhaps in Harvey Cox's The Secular City from 1965, or the Death of God theology in the 1960s and 70s. In all of these theories, religion retained a broad value-orientating function, but lost its dogmatic and institutional authority through pluralization and differentiation, and at least overt state neutrality. For development actors, this entailed turning a blind eye to religions. Religious beliefs and practices might still be central to certain target communities, but they could play no role in the practice of international development cooperation. Now to the final turn of the story, the return, so-called return of religion and Christianity in development. So the sociological idea of a receding religion in the modern world was ill-equipped to assess religious developments in Africa and elsewhere. The just mentioned Harvey Cox became a case in point when in 1995 he wrote another bestseller about the rise of global Pentecostalism, completely reversing his prior stance on secularism to a global renaissance of religion. This was in line with the emerging revenge of God theories in political science, sociology, and theology, which culminated in the fundamentalism project or Huntington's idea of the clash of civilization. Yet, even as we see this kind of return of religion in political theory, development studies did not yet join the conversation to any noticeable extent until nudged by the political system to do so. And this nudge came through evangelical Christianity in the form of the neoliberal rollback of the state and the resulting compensatory role taken on by non-state actors. The 1996 Welfare Reform Act, forced on Clinton by Newt Gingrich's Congress during Clinton's re-election campaign, contained a so-called charitable choice provision, which encouraged states to utilize charitable and religious organizations for delivering welfare services. This provision had been introduced by Senator John Ashcroft, a devout Pentecostal Christian. He then goes on to become Homeland Secretary under Bush and wrote the famous torture memos, Assemblies of God member, with the express purpose of encouraging the involvement of faith actors, this provision, this charitable choice provision. And Ashcroft later boasted about this and saying, well, I brought the churches back into charitable collaboration with the government. While the bill protected clients against religious discrimination, it also effectively eroded a stricter interpretation of the separation clause of the First Amendment, which had hitherto prevented taxpayer-funded programs from utilizing religious services. George Bush, the younger George W. Bush, had made an extensive use of the charitable choice provision as governor of Texas and quickly expanded its scope to the federal level when he became president. In only his second week in office, he signed 2 executive orders, one creating a White House office for faith-based and community initiatives, and the other forming corresponding units in 5 other departments. At this point, it's only labor, justice, housing, urban development, as well as education, health, and human services. Charitable choice and the visibility Bush granted religious groups in his government agenda were highly controversial at the time, as many of us will remember, and the political debate soon culminated in the Community Solutions Act, the so-called H.R. 7 bill, which would have expanded the charitable choice provision to most social service programs. Narrowly adopted by the House, the bill, however, failed to clear the Senate, and now the Bush White House reacted with a number of executive orders in late 2002 to implement some of its provisions anyway. And it's at this point that charitable choice and the language of faith-based organizations spilled over into the development sector, because one of these orders created the Center for Faith-Based and Community Initiatives in USAID, with the explicit mandate to, I quote, eliminate regulatory, contracting, and other programmatic obstacles to the participation of faith-based and other community organizations, end of quote. During his presidency, Bush almost doubled funding to faith-based groups from 10.5% of aid in 2001 to 19.9% in 2005, with much of this going to evangelical Christian organizations. The World Bank, who had begun to emphasize local factors, including religion, by the turn of the century also intensified its effort in faith dialogue and at about the same time. Other countries, notably the UK, Switzerland, Netherlands, and Denmark, soon followed suit and began to fund and utilize FBOs in faith-based organizations, FBOs, in domestic and international projects. Development scholarship now picked up on these practices. The first publications in this area were centered on the category of the faith-based organization, the FBO itself, highlighting on the one hand the difficulty of defining this category, so when is a development organization a faith-based one? And on the other hand, upholding its distinction from so-called secular NGOs. Soon this broadened into a wider discussion of religion and development, and a new field emerged in the intersection of development studies and religious studies with increased research funding and the publication of special journal issues, edited volumes, and textbooks. This reemergence of religion as a legitimate subject in development enabled practitioners and scholars to better account for the views and institutional constraints of religious actors, but it also came with its own impositions. Firstly, the category of faith-based organizations and the funding stream that it unlocks created a new and artificial separations in many African and Asian contexts, where religious actors and communities have long been closely involved with governmental and non-governmental development efforts and often function as gatekeepers for international NGOs. And this is often not without ironies. Before, religious institutions had to accept the secularism of development aid, and now they were encouraged to establish religious, faith-based organizations. Furthermore, the reinsertion of religion into the development discourse did not generally lead to an increase of religious literacy among development actors, and the impetus to evaluate development potential of a particular religion often leads to unhelpful generalizations or essentialisms. So there's utilitarianism in how you engage religious actors. Are these useful? How can we work together? Rather than asking how religious actors help translate, perhaps, and what programmatic priorities religious actors themselves might have in development. Finally, despite the increased tendency to utilize religious institutions for development intervention, there seems to be less sympathy toward letting religious actors influence the programming of development. As I already mentioned, the Sustainable Development Goal process, for example, involved religious organizations only very late, and the ability of religious actors to shape the implementation of the Sustainable Development Agenda depends on a variety of local political factors. And this is where my more recent research has come in. Before I conclude, I just have one slide here that I wanted to show you on the faith-based organization language. This is a so-called Google Ngram. So Google kind of searches textbooks for certain terms. And you can kind of see how the language of faith-based organization really does not play a role at all until the late 1990s, when it gets picked up through government jargon and then spills over into development discourses. So we have an entirely new category of the faith-based organization alongside the non-governmental organization emerging at this time. So I conclude. The argument of my admittedly rather selective and still fairly rough genealogy has been that in order to fully understand the current interest in religion and development, a longer history must be told, which draws out the colonial and post-colonial mutations of this theme and locates concepts of secularity firmly within the debate about the role of religion in modern society. In such a history, the development project hardly emerges as a normatively secular enterprise of scientific modernism, but as one rooted in a long history of Christian activism, civilizing, and providentialism, which still featured in Truman's Point 4 speech. Yet, secularity and state neutrality were not mere later twists of a story, but an integral part from the start. Settler interests, in my German East African example, and political considerations revolved around economizing colonial progress, and Christianity, alongside other religions, were measured against this goal. Economic indicators and theories were also the cornerstone of post-Second World War development theory, but a Christian notion of religion was built in as a motivator or inhibitor of economic progress and the ethical foundation of a certain political or economic system. These were largely Western debates about the role of religion in society, and inasmuch as they failed to account for the continued relevance of religious practices and institutions elsewhere, the latest turn to religion was also not rooted in a better observation of global religious dynamics, but rather in a US-American political twist, driven by neoliberalism and the Christian right. From this vantage point, the question of religion in development appears as a soliloquy of the so-called developed countries, a discourse with long-standing global consequences, but one that needs to be provincialized in a particular European history of the discussion of church and state.